Welcome to Torture Vault, where history bleeds, and the screams of the past echo through the ages. Here, we uncover the darkest punishments, brutal executions, and horrifying truths the world tried to forget. Viewer discretion is advised, because this is not just history, this is horror, carved in flesh and blood. In the bitter chill of early 1692, in a small Puritan village buried deep in the wilderness of Massachusetts Bay, fear gave birth to one of history's darkest chapters, the Salem Witch Trials. Salem was not a festive town of Halloween folklore, it was a rigid, God-fearing community entrenched in religious extremism and superstition. Life was harsh. Crop failures, disease, and fear of Native American attacks created a volatile atmosphere where the line between divine punishment and natural disaster was indistinguishable. The Puritans believed the world was a battlefield between God and Satan, and those who strayed from the path of righteousness could become instruments of the devil. In this bleak setting, the hysteria began with two young girls. In January 1692, Reverend Samuel Parris's household was shaken when his niece, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, and his daughter, 9-year-old Elizabeth, Betty, Parris, began suffering violent fits, screaming, contorting, and speaking in tongues. When no medical cause could be found, the diagnosis of bewitched began to circulate. Other girls in Salem, including Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, began exhibiting similar behavior and named those they claimed had bewitched them. Thus began a tragic chain of accusations. The first three accused were outcasts. Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave from Barbados who spoke of spirits and charms. Sarah Good, a homeless woman with a bad reputation. And Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had fallen out with the Puritan church. Tituba, under pressure, confessed to witchcraft and claimed there were others in Salem working with the devil. This confession, laced with supernatural imagery and sensational detail, gave credence to the idea that a witch conspiracy had taken hold of Salem. To manage the growing crisis, Governor William Phips established the Court of Oyer and Termine in May 1692. The court, led by Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted spectral evidence, testimony that a spirit or ghost of the accused had afflicted the victim. It was a dangerous precedent, allowing dreams and hallucinations to become damning proof. The Putnam family, particularly 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., became prolific accusers. Many they accused had land disputes or old grudges with the Putnams, suggesting personal vendettas were at play beneath the cloak of religious righteousness. Even respected members of the community, like elderly Rebecca Nurse, were not safe. Despite her piety and good reputation, spectral testimony led to her arrest. As the trials proceeded, more than 150 people were accused, and executions began. The first was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1692. Known for wearing flamboyant clothes and speaking her mind, Bishop's perceived defiance of Puritan norms sealed her fate. She went to the gallows maintaining her innocence. Conditions in Salem's jails were deplorable. Prisoners, including children like 4-year-old Dorothy Good, were shackled and confined in dark, disease-ridden cells. Dorothy, imprisoned after saying her mother had a snake friend, would never recover from the trauma. The cruel irony was that confession often spared one's life, though not one's freedom. Those who professed innocence were more likely to be executed, while those who confessed to witchcraft and named others often avoided the noose. The roots of the hysteria remain debated. Some scholars blame ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold found in rye. Others cite socio-political tensions, patriarchal oppression, and the unforgiving theology of Puritanism. Regardless of the cause, the Salem Witch Trials remain a chilling reminder of how fear, religion, and power can turn neighbor against neighbor. In Salem, cries of witch echoed through the woods and over church pews. The devil, it seemed, needed no disguise. He wore the faces of those you knew, until you watched them hang. By July 1692, the shadow of fear had become an ever-present cloud over Salem. The once quiet farming village was now a stage for mass paranoia, where the accused could be anyone, your neighbor, your spouse, or even your child. As accusations spread, the divide between truth and hysteria became impossible to navigate. Whole families were torn apart by suspicion. Husbands testified against wives, siblings against each other. The line between innocence and guilt was no longer drawn by facts, but by fear. With the court relying on spectral evidence and confessions coerced under pressure, the trials spiraled further into darkness. One of the most heart-wrenching cases involved Martha Corey, a devout and outspoken critic of the trials. She dared to question the legitimacy of the girls' accusations, believing the hysteria to be baseless. In return, she found herself accused of witchcraft. Despite her spotless reputation and strong moral character, Martha was arrested and imprisoned. Her husband, Giles Corey, also fell under suspicion. Refusing to plead guilty or not guilty, Giles was subjected to the brutal practice of pressing, crushed slowly under heavy stones in an attempt to force a confession. For 2 agonizing days, he remained silent, his last words famously recorded as, "More weight." Giles Corey's death marked a grim turning point. It was a rare case of execution without trial, and his stoic resistance began to stir doubt in the hearts of the public. But still, the executions continued. On July 19, 5 more women were hanged: Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca's death was particularly disturbing. She had long been regarded as a saintly figure in Salem. Her execution shook the community, especially because her own church had excommunicated her just days before her hanging. As summer turned to autumn, the hysteria showed no signs of abating. On August 19, 5 more people, including Reverend George Burroughs, were executed. Burroughs's hanging was chilling. As he stood on the scaffold, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a feat believed impossible for witches. The crowd hesitated, murmurs of doubt rippling through the spectators. But Judge Stoughton pushed forward with the sentence. The gallows claimed another innocent life. The jail cells of Salem were overflowing. Men, women, and even children were confined in squalid conditions, many falling ill or dying before their cases could even be heard. Among the imprisoned was Sarah Good's infant child, born in jail and named Mercy. She did not survive. Food was scarce, disease rampant, and hope nearly extinguished. The accused faced a grim choice: confess to crimes they did not commit or maintain their innocence and face execution. Many chose to confess, falsely implicating others in desperate bids to save themselves. The weight of so many deaths began to fracture the public consensus. Prominent voices began to rise against the trials. Reverend Increase Mather, father of the influential minister Cotton Mather, publicly denounced the use of spectral evidence. In his words, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than 1 innocent person be condemned." His pamphlet criticizing the court's reliance on intangible proof began to sway public opinion. Questions arose. Why were so many respectable citizens suddenly witches? Why were confessions rewarded, and denials punished with death? By October, the tide had begun to turn. Governor Phipps, alarmed by the growing backlash and the imprisonment of his own wife on witchcraft charges, finally intervened. He dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termine and replaced it with a new court that no longer accepted spectral evidence. With this shift, many of the remaining cases were dismissed. Those still imprisoned were gradually released over the following months. But for the 20 people executed and several others who died in jail, justice came too late. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials left deep scars. Public apologies were issued, and in 1697, a day of fasting and soul-searching was declared across Massachusetts. Some judges admitted their errors, others remained silent. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prolific accusers, came forward to confess her role in the tragedy. She asked for forgiveness, blaming the devil for misleading her. But for many families, the damage could never be undone. Lands were lost, reputations destroyed, and trauma became an unspoken legacy. The Salem Witch Trials were not merely a product of superstition, but of theocratic extremism, social tensions, and deep-seated fears. The world had not yet learned to separate faith from fanaticism, evidence from imagination. What happened in Salem was a warning, an echo through time of what can occur when fear overrides reason, and when justice is shaped not by truth, but by terror. 3 centuries later, the fields of Salem are quiet. The gallows have long since rotted, and the prisons have turned to dust. But the ghosts of 1692 remain, etched into stone, whispered through history. And as long as fear can still grip the hearts of communities, Salem's story will remain tragically relevant. The closing chapter of the Salem Witch Trials is as revealing as it is sobering. By late 1692 and early 1693, the once fiery public appetite for rooting out witches had all but vanished. The same community that had gathered eagerly to watch the gallows now turned its gaze inward in shame and reflection. The courts, stripped of spectral evidence, began acquitting many of the remaining accused. But even acquittal came at a steep price: months of imprisonment, humiliation, and the loss of livelihood. Among those released was Elizabeth Proctor, the pregnant wife of John Proctor, who had been hanged the previous year. Because of her pregnancy, her execution had been delayed. She survived long enough for the hysteria to fade, but she emerged from jail to find herself a widow, her children orphaned, her property seized, and her reputation destroyed. Her story became symbolic of the long-lasting damage caused by the trials. Physical survival was not enough to erase the emotional and social scars left behind. By May 1693, Governor Phipps had pardoned the remaining accused. Yet, many remained in prison because they could not afford the jail fees, a cruel system in which the innocent had to pay for their own captivity. Lawsuits followed. Families of the dead and imprisoned filed petitions to reclaim lost property, restore names, and demand justice. But justice came slowly. It wasn't until 1702 that the General Court of Massachusetts declared the trials unlawful. Even then, the court stopped short of officially exonerating all the victims. Some efforts, however, were made to heal. In 1711, a bill was passed to provide restitution to the families of 22 of the accused, including financial compensation and formal reversal of attainders' convictions. Still, the damage had long since rooted itself into the fabric of Massachusetts history. Many descendants of the accused lived in quiet dignity, avoiding association with the events. Some even changed their names to escape the lingering stigma. The story of the Salem Witch Trials did not die with the final execution. It endured in books, sermons, academic studies, and eventually, in the American cultural imagination. It became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of the dangers of religious extremism, unchecked authority, and mass hysteria. Writers, historians, and artists returned to it again and again, trying to understand how such terror could have taken hold in a society founded on Puritan ideals of justice and morality. In the 19th century, as America grappled with its identity amid civil wars and social reform, Salem was re-examined. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of Judge Hathorne, one of the chief magistrates of the trials, wrestled with the legacy of his ancestor. His novel The House of the Seven Gables and other works often touched on themes of inherited guilt and moral reckoning, deeply influenced by the events of 1692. In the 20th century, playwright Arthur Miller would famously use Salem as an allegory in The Crucible, 1953, drawing parallels between the witch trials and the McCarthy hearings of the era. Miller's play reminded Americans that the forces of fear, persecution, and mob justice were not confined to the past. Just as innocent people had been condemned in 1692, so too were many blacklisted during the Red Scare for supposed ties to communism. Salem itself transformed. Once a symbol of terror, it became a place of pilgrimage, first for historians, then for tourists. By the 1970s, Salem embraced its past, establishing museums, memorials, and even Halloween-themed attractions. The Salem Witch Museum opened in 1972, drawing visitors from around the world. Some criticized the commercialization, but others saw it as a way to keep the story alive, a public acknowledgement that the trials were real, that the victims were human, and that their suffering was not in vain. Today, the names of the 20 executed victims, like Giles Corey, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Good, are etched in stone at the Salem Witch Trials Memorial. Located near the original site of the executions, the memorial is a place of quiet reflection. Each bench bears the name of a victim, the date of execution, and a brief quote from their trial. These quotes often speak to innocence, to strength, and to defiance in the face of madness. One of the most poignant elements of the memorial is its design. The stone benches appear to float, suspended out from a solid wall, symbolizing lives cut short. Flowers, letters, and tokens are left daily by visitors, honoring not only the victims but all those in history who have suffered under the weight of false accusations and mob justice. In recent years, new research and digital archives have shed further light on the trials. Genealogical tools have allowed many Americans to discover their ancestral ties to the victims or the accusers. Public school curriculums now include Salem as a case study in critical thinking, legal ethics, and the need for due process. Scholars continue to debate the causes. Was it mold-contaminated rye triggering hallucinations? Political instability, gender-based oppression, or the psychological effects of isolation and fear in a closed, religious society? Though the exact causes may never be fully agreed upon, the lessons are crystal clear. The Salem Witch Trials show how easily fear can corrode the foundations of justice. They remind us that good people can do terrible things when they are gripped by panic, when authority goes unchecked, and when dissent is silenced. They remind us that the rule of law must be grounded in reason, evidence, and compassion. And most importantly, they remind us that justice delayed is justice denied. It took centuries for Massachusetts to fully clear the names of the accused. It wasn't until 2001, 309 years after the trials, that the last 5 victims were officially exonerated. The wheels of justice turned painfully slow, but they did turn. This final act, though symbolic, was a long overdue acknowledgement that the real crime was not witchcraft, but the persecution of innocent people. The Salem Witch Trials may have taken place over 330 years ago, but their legacy lives on. They continue to echo in courtrooms, classrooms, and conversations around the world. In a time when misinformation spreads rapidly, when groupthink threatens to override truth, and when fear once again stalks the public sphere, the story of Salem remains more relevant than ever. It stands as a monument, not to witches, but to the power of belief, and to the necessity of vigilance. The trials were not a fluke of history, but a mirror held up to human nature. And what they reveal is uncomfortable. Our capacity for cruelty when we are afraid, our willingness to destroy others to preserve our own illusion of control. But in that darkness, there is also light. In the courage of Giles Corey. In the defiance of Rebecca Nurse. In the repentance of Ann Putnam. And in the long, painful journey toward justice. Salem is not just a story of horror. It is a story of human weakness, and of the resilience that rises when we choose to confront it. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials continued to influence American society in unexpected ways. Though the executions ended, the psychological and moral weight of what had transpired left a deep mark on the New England consciousness. Many of the judges and ministers who had taken part in the trials lived with regret, and some issued public confessions of guilt. Reverend Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in his church in 1697 and declared a day of fasting and repentance, accepting the blame for innocent bloodshed. Sewall's public apology was unprecedented at the time. While others remained silent or defensive, Sewall set a precedent for moral reckoning. He wore sackcloth on the day of repentance, stood before the congregation while prayers were said for mercy, and committed to a life of humility. His actions were rare, but they planted seeds of awareness in a community still haunted by its own cruelty. The clergy also faced scrutiny. Reverend Cotton Mather, once a respected theologian and a supporter of the trials, saw his reputation damaged permanently. Though he never fully admitted wrongdoing, his cautious tone in later writings revealed a man conflicted by the outcome of events he had helped to justify. His father, Increase Mather, attempted to mitigate the damage by emphasizing the dangers of using spectral evidence, but the stain had set in. Families of the accused struggled to reintegrate into society. Many were shunned or reduced to poverty, and despite legal pardons, the social stigma endured for generations. Children of the condemned carried the burden of their parents' supposed guilt, and some even fled Massachusetts to escape the whispers and judgment. The scars of 1692 outlived the era itself, woven into the DNA of American identity. Intellectually, the Salem Witch Trials spurred debate about justice, governance, and evidence. Philosophers and legal scholars in the colonies began to call for stricter requirements in criminal cases, especially regarding the admissibility of personal visions or supernatural testimony. The notion that one could be executed based on dreams or the afflicted behavior of others became a cautionary tale in jurisprudence. In the 18th century, as Enlightenment thinking gained traction, Salem was remembered less for the witchcraft and more as a failure of logic and justice. Political leaders cited it in arguments for separating church and state. The notion that religious fervor could contaminate legal proceedings became an enduring warning in the development of American democratic principles. Even centuries later, during the drafting of the United States Constitution, echoes of Salem's injustices can be felt. The guarantee of due process, the right to face one's accuser, the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, These ideals were informed not only by English law but also by the painful lessons learned in Puritan New England. The witch trials also left a cultural legacy. Writers, poets, and playwrights kept the memory of Salem alive through allegory and criticism. In the 1800s, the Romantic and Gothic movements found fertile ground in the tragic elements of Salem. Supernatural themes merged with historical memory, creating stories that were as much about ghosts of the past as they were about literal specters. The name, Salem, became synonymous with paranoia and persecution. It was no longer just a town, it was a symbol. A place where fear overcame reason, where religion became weaponized, and where authority went unchallenged until it was too late. Salem came to represent a uniquely American horror, the execution of justice without justice itself. Education changed too. By the 20th century, textbooks described the witch trials not as isolated events, but as a moral failure of early American society. Students were taught that even devout, well-meaning people could fall victim to hysteria. The story of Salem was used to cultivate skepticism toward unverified claims and to promote fairness in legal matters. As American society progressed, new moments of paranoia were compared to Salem. The Red Scare, the McCarthy hearings, and other waves of ideological persecution were all likened to witch hunts. The term, witch hunt, became a metaphor for any campaign against supposed enemies where evidence was scarce and emotions high. This linguistic evolution solidified Salem's place in cultural consciousness. Political cartoons showed figures being burned by public opinion. Media analysts called out witch hunts in journalism and pop culture. The story transformed into a broader symbol of collective panic, often invoked to critique the justice system or mass psychology. Salem's transformation into a tourist destination is a complex chapter. On one hand, it has allowed for public education and remembrance. Museums, reenactments, and historical sites offer visitors a glimpse into the realities of 1692. On the other, the commercialization of trauma has raised ethical questions. Haunted houses and novelty witch hats sometimes risk trivializing the true horror of the trials. Despite this, many descendants of the victims continue to honor their ancestors through historical societies and activism. Some have even worked with city officials to ensure that the memorials remain respectful and informative. In 2001, Governor Jane Swift signed legislation exonerating the final group of wrongly accused victims, bringing a long overdue sense of closure to families who had waited over 3 centuries. The names of the victims have become emblems of innocence: Martha Corey, Sarah Good, George Burroughs, and so many others. Their defiance, silence, or calm acceptance of fate has turned them into martyrs of reason. They represent not weakness but strength, the courage to face injustice without surrendering to it. Today, Salem remains a dual space. It is at once a reminder of a grim past and a vibrant present. The town has embraced its identity as a place of reflection, offering festivals that blend history with cautionary storytelling. Academic conferences and school trips coexist with costume parties and ghost tours. It's a living example of how societies process trauma, through memory, myth, and media. The trials have even impacted how we view mental health. Modern psychologists have analyzed the events as an outbreak of collective delusion or mass psychogenic illness. The behaviors of the afflicted girls, once thought to be evidence of demonic possession, are now understood through lenses of trauma, repression, and manipulation. This shift in understanding shows how far society has come in interpreting human behavior. Salem also stands as an early example of gendered violence. The majority of the accused were women, especially those who were outspoken, widowed, or otherwise outside the norms of Puritan femininity. Scholars today view the trials as part of a larger pattern of patriarchal control, using fear and law to suppress female agency. This feminist perspective offers another layer of meaning to the historical tragedy. Even in the digital age, the specter of Salem haunts us. Social media, cancellations, viral accusations, and online mobs often mirror the dynamics of 1692. Accusation without context, emotion over evidence, and irreversible damage before the truth can surface. The mechanics may differ, but the psychology remains frighteningly similar. Ultimately, the Salem witch trials are more than a relic. They are a living story, a parable that renews itself with each generation. They teach that justice must be blind not only to wealth and power but also to hysteria and vengeance. That the truth must be defended, even when fear is the more comfortable ally. As the town of Salem continues to evolve, so does the meaning of its darkest chapter. Its museums teach children to question authority, its memorials inspire reflection, and its history stands as an eternal caution. To visit Salem is to walk among ghosts, not of the supernatural, but of human error, pride, and the search for redemption. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.